To help us dig deeper, let's bring in Daniel Fried. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Poland who's had experience crafting NATO-Russia relations and is now a fellow at the Atlantic Council. Good to have you, Ambassador. Russia is holding a presidential election next month. There are no serious opposition candidates running, but even imprisoned Navalny was a big voice for anti-Putin forces. Who is next, or are there any other voices left?
Well, Russia is not having a presidential election. It's having a kind of sham process in which the Kremlin, the Putin system, has weeded out any credible candidates. There was an anti-war candidate in these so-called elections who had generated a lot of excitement, and the Navalny organization was backing him. But when this person, Boris Nadezhdin, seemed to be gaining some traction, the Kremlin suddenly decided to remove him as a candidate. They claimed technical irregularities and he couldn't run. So let's be clear, this is not an election. You asked whether there are other leaders of Russia's beleaguered democratic dissident movement, and in fact there are. One personal friend of mine, actually, Vladimir Kara-Murza, like Navalny, went back to Russia fearing he might be arrested, and indeed he was. He is in prison. I suppose he's vulnerable to the Kremlin's thirst for blood. But there are a number of Russians inside and outside Russia who could fill this role.
Navalny has a checkered past with his politics. He's made anti-immigrant comments and allied with ultranationalists. He's said Crimea is now a part of Russia, and that's just the reality, but then walked some of those positions back. Given Russia's war in Ukraine and the saber rattling we've seen, are there any alternatives that might seek friendlier ties with neighboring countries and the West?
Navalny's record, as you say, was mixed. But as time went on, he developed a more consistent position opposing Russian imperialism as well as the corruption of the Putin regime. So Navalny was a charismatic figure. He exposed Putin's corruption and did an awfully good job of it. That's one of the reasons I suspect that he's been killed. Are there other potential leaders in Russia? Putin has been in power for 24 years. He has made sure that there are few visible alternatives. He's murdered some of them. He's intimidated others. He's forced still others into exile. But in history, when the circumstances change, leaders can emerge. The problem in Russia is not that there's a shortage of leaders, but that the opposition in Russia has yet to bite. But if you look carefully, you can sense the cracks in the facade of Putin's regime. There seems to be unhappiness in Russia beneath the surface. And fighting a war they may not win in Ukraine is one way that change could come.
Let's talk about what the U.S. is going to do now. I want you to listen to what President Biden said back in 2021, putting Putin on notice about Navalny. Let's take a listen.
I made it clear to him that I believe the consequences of that would be devastating for Russia. I'll go back to the same point. What do you think happens when he's saying it's not about hurting Navalny, all the stuff he says to rationalize the treatment of Navalny, and then he dies in prison?
That was almost 3 years ago, and now it's happened. Navalny is, by all accounts, dead, something that he even talked about before his death. Is President Biden being forceful enough in his response, or what should the next steps be for the American president?
The best way to defeat Putinism is to help Ukraine in its war of national survival. And it is, frankly, shameful and shocking that the U.S. Congress has been sitting on essential aid for Ukraine for many months. The Ukrainians don't want Americans to fight for them. They want to fight for themselves. They're just asking for the arms, the the ammunition to do it. If you want to beat Putin, if you want to push back on the dictator, help the country that's resisting him. That would be a good way to respond to Navalny's death. For the Congress to stop walking in circles and find the courage to go against Donald Trump and vote the money for Ukraine. There are other things the administration and other Western governments could do. Collectively, they're sitting on over $300 billion of perfectly good Russian money that the G7, the US, and other governments locked down at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It would be good to use that money to help Ukraine, to make Russia, not the American taxpayer, start paying for Putin's war of aggression. So there are things we can do.
Before we let you go, Ambassador, I want to get to this, something that's happening stateside. Let's talk about what seems to be a crop of pro-Russian or pro-Putin voices in the West and in the U.S. There's former President Trump, who regularly praises Putin and other dictators. He said he'd let Russia do whatever it wants with NATO allies, he says, aren't paying enough. He's rallied Republican lawmakers to oppose aid for Ukraine. Then there's former Fox News Channel host Tucker Carlson. Russian media monitors point out he's been featured on Russian state media as he shared talking points that aligned with the Kremlin's point of view. And he sat down with Putin himself, but offered no pushback to the Russian leader's various claims. And he was asked why at a forum just days later. Take a quick listen.
You didn't talk about freedom of speech in Russia. You did not talk about Navalny, about assassinations, about the restrictions on opposition in the coming elections.
I didn't talk about the things that every other American media outlet talks about.
Why?
Exclusively.
Yes, this
because
is my
those
question.
are covered, and because I have spent my life talking to people who run countries in various countries and have concluded the following: that every leader kills people, including my leader. Every leader kills people. Some kill more than others. Leadership requires killing people. Sorry.
Ambassador, with the last minute we have left, what's your reaction to that? And is the Kremlin getting a foothold among American voters?
My reaction is Tucker Carlson is a sucker. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know the difference between defending freedom and crushing free people. It used to be that the American left, American communists and leftists, used to parade to Moscow and didn't have any idea what they were seeing, but they thought they were looking at a socialist paradise. They were fools. Right now, the right wing, people like Tucker Carlson, go to Moscow and they think they're seeing some kind of Christian utopia led by a strongman. Again, like the left of yesteryear, they have no idea what they're looking at. Tucker Carlson is completely out of his depth. And it's time, I hope, for the Republican Party to rediscover its inner Ronald Reagan, just as the Democrats, I think, successfully rediscovered their inner Harry Truman and JFK in standing up to Putin's aggression.
Ambassador Daniel Fried, thank you so much for making time for us tonight. We appreciate your time and your expertise on the matter.
Thanks for having me.